He ran on the non-extension of slavery. He ran on a kind of moderate Republican platform on the issue of economics. But more than anything else, I think he won because, from the standpoint of those people who were opposed to slavery, he was the only choice.
At 52 years old, the boy born in a cabin was heading for the White House. Southern states, where slavery was key to the way of life, were furious. Within weeks of his election, 11 states left the Union. The first was South Carolina.
This began a process, almost like a fall of dominoes, where one by one the other southern states joined South Carolina in seceding from the federal union.
They said, we cannot be a part of a nation that has elected, and they said, an abolitionist president. There's no way that Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was an abolitionist. He had said over and over again that he was not going to allow slavery to expand into the territory. From the standpoint of Americans, whether we're talking about Americans in the North or Americans in the South, the territory represented America's future. So said differently, what Abraham Lincoln was really saying is, I am not going to allow slavery to expand into America's future. From the standpoint of the South, what he was saying was, I want slavery to die eventually.
Again and again, Lincoln had pledged that he would not interfere with slavery. Constitutionally, he couldn't, but the South did not believe him. They were convinced that he would use his powers to destroy their way of life.
They saw at once that Lincoln as president was a threat to them. First of all, as president, he had discretionary powers for appointing federal offices all through the South. What would happen if Lincoln appointed abolitionists to every one of those post offices to distribute then abolitionist literature? Or to appoint federal marshals who were abolitionists, who therefore would not chase down runaway slaves? Their conclusion was, let's get out of the Union while we still can.
He becomes president, and he is president of a fragmented nation. He is president at a time when it is not at all clear that the nation is going to continue to exist. One of the things we have to understand, they didn't have the advantages that we have. They couldn't look back from the 21st century and say, well, you know, everything's going to be all right by 1865. From their standpoint, the nation was coming to an end, and it seemed very logical to make that assumption.
It was time for Lincoln to leave his home in Springfield for the White House. Daunted by the task ahead of him, his spontaneity, warmth, and eloquence marked the occasion.
It was not a prepared speech. It was almost by accident. But he spoke of how much he owed to everyone in Springfield, how deeply dependent he was on them for their support and their prayers. And he bid them, he said, an affectionate farewell. And there was a note of wistfulness in that he was now going to something, the dimensions of which he did not fully comprehend.
The rebel states of the South, now separate from the North, renamed themselves the Confederate States of America. Civil war was now a very real threat. United States troops still had a foothold in the South. They were occupying Fort Sumter, a small island garrison controlling Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. The newly formed Confederate Army was determined to remove them. In April 1861, the Confederates fired the first shot at the fort. This started the bloodiest war in American history. America was now at war with itself. Abraham Lincoln had to hold the Union together, and he would need every ounce of his courage and skill to achieve it. Lincoln's presidency began disastrously. The South left the Union, and a vicious civil war commenced. Within months, thousands of Union soldiers were killed, and Lincoln was branded an incompetent leader. Only the Potomac River separated Washington, D.C. from Confederate Virginia. The other border slave states nearest the capital stayed with the Union, but only just.
During the early years of the war, Abraham Lincoln was very concerned that the war was not going well. He was very much afraid that the border states would not remain loyal to the nation. And so when slaves from the South came into U.S. lines seeking sanctuary, often he encouraged his generals to return them.
He insisted from his inaugural address onwards that the war was about reunion. If he had at the beginning of his presidency said, "I shall now make this into a war on the subject of slavery," Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware would have bounded south like jackrabbits.
If these states became part of the Confederacy, control of the great rivers of America would move to the south. The commercial highways of their day, without the rivers, the war would be over before it began. The Union Army's military might was huge. Winning should have been easy, but Lincoln was poorly served by his generals.
Lincoln's impact was remote because of his own unsureness of what he was doing. He felt he had to rely on the experts, and so he turns to the ancient general of the Army, Winfield Scott, for direction on military affairs, and of course is given all the wrong answers. The Northern Army goes off to the Battle of Bull Run and has its nose very well bloodied. He then turns to another great expert, George B. McClellan. When McClellan delays and hesitates and delays and hesitates, all that Lincoln will do is to say, well, you know, he is the military expert. I really shouldn't be meddling in these affairs. It takes him at least 8 months before he finally realizes that he is going to have to meddle in these affairs. He is going to have to take direct control, because if he doesn't, nothing is going to turn out right.
Lincoln was on an incredibly steep learning curve, but now that he saw what had to be done, he got on and did it. Of the army, he said, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it." Eventually, he found the support he needed in Ulysses S. Grant, a maverick young general with the intelligence and ruthlessness needed to win. But even with Grant in charge of the army, the border states held in the Union, and the North's industrial might, the Confederate strategy was still working.
Things need to change militarily, and of course they do by the middle of 1862. They change militarily for the worse. The North is losing the war. The Confederacy is victorious. There has to be something that transforms this war from being just a war about reunion to being a moral crusade in order to rally flagging Northern opinion.
Reunion of North and South had been the battle cry so far, but it was becoming clear that this was not enough. At the end of the summer of 1862, Lincoln wrote a memorandum on the will of God. Now was the time for Lincoln to make the bravest decision of his presidency.
He thought the war was going to be for Union, but the way the war was going meant that it had to have another end, and that end can only be the freedom of the slaves. This is why Lincoln comes into his cabinet meeting to announce that he is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and prefaces it by saying, "I have made a vow to my Creator."
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was made public in September 1862. It announced that from the beginning of the next year, all slaves in any state still in rebellion shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. It did not apply to the border states, and it was not obeyed by the rebels, but it succeeded in doing what Lincoln had intended it to do. It reinforced the will of the Union Army to fight on.